My husband filed for divorce at 71, moved our $3.8 million home into a company I had never heard of, and told me our son had already known about it for months. "You signed away your future the day you chose not to work," he said. I left the conference room without responding. I drove to my sister's house in Maine and sat in her kitchen for 3 weeks. Then one Tuesday morning, I opened a folder of documents that no one expected me to understand. And 6 months after that, so did the judge. Good day, dear listeners. I'm Hannah, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Please listen all the way through and leave me a comment letting me know which city you're writing from. That's how I know how far these words have traveled. People used to ask how my husband and I had lasted 46 years. I usually said something about patience and shared routines. The honest answer was simpler than that. I loved him. I loved the way he made coffee too strong every single morning and never once thought to adjust it. I loved how he called our garden shed the office, even though it held nothing but rusty tools and seed catalogs. I loved our house on Millbrook Road in Lexington, Massachusetts. The gray colonial we had bought in 1978 for less money than a used car costs today. The oak tree in the side yard that the previous owners had planted as a seedling. The screened-in back porch where I had read 10,000 pages and drunk 10,000 cups of tea. My name is Maeve Ellison. I was 70 years old when the ground began to move. My husband's name was Lawson. He was 71, still sharp, still capable of the particular certainty that had made him successful as a commercial contractor for 35 years. We had 2 children. Our son Prescott, 48, lived in Providence with his wife and their 2 boys. Our daughter Sloane, 44, lived in Concord, 30 minutes away, close enough that she stopped by on Sundays, sometimes just to drop off things she thought I needed. Tomatoes from her own garden, a magazine she'd already read, the casual presence of someone who still thought of your kitchen as partly theirs. I loved that about her. The first sign came in February. A small thing, the kind you file away and don't examine too carefully, because examining it would require you to believe something you're not ready to believe. I had been organizing the prior year's tax documents, something I had always handled, the household finances having been quietly mine by default for most of our marriage. I sorted receipts, pulled together statements, cross-referenced what I expected to find, and then I found a line I didn't recognize. A wire transfer for $62,000 from our joint savings to an entity called Millbrook Ridge Properties, LLC. The transfer had been made the previous October. I had not authorized it. I had not been told about it. I set the paper down and looked at it for a long time. I told myself there was an explanation. Lawson handled some investments on his own. He always had, even after he'd retired. Perhaps this was one of those. I was 70 years old, and I did not believe my memory was failing, but I believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt when I had loved them for nearly 5 decades. I said nothing that night. But I began to pay attention in a different way. Over the following weeks, I noticed that Lawson had started keeping his phone face down on tables. He had always been careless with it before, leaving it wherever he set it. The kitchen counter, his side of the bed, charging on the windowsill in plain view. The new habit was small, but it was new. He had become vague about where he was going. Hardware, he said. Errands. He never came back with anything. In March, I found a receipt in the pocket of his winter coat when I took it to the dry cleaner. Dinner for 2 at a restaurant in Providence. Not a neighborhood we ever went to together. Not a restaurant he had ever mentioned. The date was a Saturday in January. That Saturday, he had told me he was visiting our son. I did not confront him yet. I am not by nature an impulsive woman. I watched. I gathered. By April, I had confirmed what I had already begun to understand. Lawson was involved with a woman named Sandrine Colby. She was 48, an interior designer who had consulted on the renovation of our back porch 3 summers earlier. The one we had argued about because it went $18,000 over budget. I found her name through a series of small things, a name that a mutual acquaintance mentioned without knowing what it meant, and then an invoice in Lawson's filing cabinet, labeled for services that had already been rendered and paid. When I finally spoke to him, one Sunday morning at the kitchen table, he did not pretend. He looked at me across the same surface where we had sat for 46 years of breakfasts and said, with a steadiness that told me he had rehearsed it, "Maeve, I want to end the marriage. My attorneys will be reaching out to yours." He paused. "Prescott is aware of the situation. He's been supportive." That last sentence was where he lost me. Not the divorce, not even the betrayal. The sentence about our son. I did not respond. I stood up. I washed my coffee mug and set it in the drying rack and went upstairs to begin making a list. What followed were 4 months of legal proceedings I was not prepared for. Lawson had retained a firm in Boston with 3 attorneys, none of whom I had met before. I would later learn that he had been consulting them since the previous spring. The house on Millbrook Road, valued at $3.8 million by the time we filed, had been transferred into Millbrook Ridge Properties, LLC, the same entity I had found on the wire transfer in February. The transfer had been executed 9 months before he filed for divorce. He had also moved a significant portion of our joint retirement accounts into a separate individual account I was not named on. I retained a local attorney, a gentleman named Mr. Hatch, who had handled our wills and the sale of Lawson's mother's estate. He was thorough and kind and entirely out of his depth. The day of the initial hearing, Lawson sat at the opposing table looking composed. When the terms being proposed left me with $280,000 and no property, he glanced at me once. It was not a cruel look. It was a look of finality, the kind that says, "This is already decided." I drove afterward to my sister's house in Portland, Maine. 4 hours and 11 minutes on the interstate, and I cried for the first 2 and was quiet for the rest. My sister's name is Audra. She is 67, a retired middle school art teacher, and she lives in a small house 2 streets from the water with a cat named Bixby and more houseplants than is strictly reasonable. She opened the door before I finished climbing the porch steps and did not say anything, which was exactly what I needed. I stayed for 3 weeks. I slept poorly. I ate whatever Audra put in front of me. I let the cat sleep against my feet and was surprised by how much it helped. And I made lists. That is how I have always processed the hard things, by writing them down, naming them, refusing to let them remain formless. On the first list, I wrote down what had been taken: the house at the top, the oak tree, the screened porch, the kitchen where I had cooked 46 years of dinners. Below that, the money. Below that, I wrote Prescott's name. He had called me once after the initial hearing. He said his father had explained the situation, and that he hoped I would try to understand that sometimes marriages reach a natural end. He hung up before I could ask him what he knew about the LLC. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while, and then I wrote his name on the list, not out of bitterness, but out of the need to acknowledge what was real. Sloane had texted. She said she was staying out of it. I understood that better than I wanted to. In the second week at Audra's, sitting at her kitchen table with a cooling cup of tea, I asked myself the question that changed everything. Not, what do I do now? I had been asking that since February. The question was more specific. Had the transfer of the house to the LLC happened before or after Lawson had decided to divorce me? Because if it happened after the decision, it was not estate planning. It was fraud. I was not a lawyer. I had been a librarian for 31 years, and I knew how to research a question when it mattered. I called Mr. Hatch from Audra's kitchen and asked him one thing. Had he independently confirmed when the LLC was incorporated relative to Lawson's decision to seek divorce? There was a pause on the line. "Mrs. Ellison," he said carefully. "I reviewed the disclosures as submitted." That was not the same thing. He knew it, and I knew it. I told him I appreciated his work and asked for a referral to someone who specialized in asset concealment in high-value divorce cases. He gave me 2 names. I called the second one, a woman named Sylvie Renard at a firm in Cambridge, and made an appointment for the following Monday. I wore the gray blazer I had bought for a library fundraiser gala, because I have always believed in dressing appropriately for things that matter. Sylvie was in her early 50s, direct, with the kind of contained attention I associated with people who spend their professional lives in rooms where everything depends on precision. She did not raise her voice or simplify her language for me. She asked me to start from the beginning, and I talked for nearly 2 hours while she filled 3 pages of a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she set her pen down and looked at what she had written. "The LLC formation date is the first thing we need," she said. "If it was incorporated after Lawson had already decided to file, and there are ways to establish that intent, you have grounds to challenge the entire settlement on fraud grounds." She was not making promises. She was identifying a door that might be open. I retained her that afternoon. It cost $9,500 upfront, a third of what I had immediately accessible, and I paid without hesitating. Some expenses are not expenses. They are decisions. Sylvie filed a post-judgment motion within 2 weeks, citing potential fraudulent conveyance and requesting full discovery of Lawson's financial records for the prior 30 months. The court accepted it. Formal discovery notices went to his attorneys. I know the moment Lawson found out because Prescott called me. It was a Thursday evening. Audra and I had been watching a nature documentary about migratory birds, which sounds peaceful and was. My phone lit up with Prescott's number. The first call since that single disappointing one after the hearing. His voice was tight in the way it gets when he is working hard to sound calm. "Mom, Dad says you've hired new attorneys. He says you're trying to reopen everything." "I filed a post-judgment motion," I said. "That's accurate." "This is going to cost you money you don't have and drag everything out. Dad is trying to be fair about this." "Prescott," I said, "did your father ask you to call me?" Silence, which answered the question. "Tell him I said hello," I said, and I ended the call. I sat for a moment looking at the phone. What Lawson had done was not simply call his attorney. He had handed our son a script, and our son had read it. That told me something important about both of them. The documents from Discovery arrived 6 weeks later. I drove to Cambridge to review them with Sylvie in person. Millbrook Ridge Properties, LLC had been incorporated in Delaware on March 3rd. Lawson had filed for divorce the following October. 7 months later. That gap, on its face, looked like planning that predated the divorce decision. It might not have been enough on its own. But the documents that mattered most were a series of emails recovered during discovery. Communications between Lawson and Sandrine, beginning the previous January. In one of them, Lawson had written, "Sandrine, I need the property structure in place before I move forward with filing. Once it's done, the house is outside the marital estate and she has no claim on it. Can you put together a projected valuation for the renovation work so we have documentation on the books?" January. While I was sitting across from him at the kitchen table, drinking his overly strong coffee, reading the seed catalogs for spring. I read that email in Sylvie's office on a gray Wednesday afternoon and felt something in me crystallize into something architectural. Cold and load-bearing and not going anywhere. Not rage. I had moved through rage and out the other side. This was the recognition that I had been planned against by someone I had trusted completely, and that the planning was documented, and that I was going to use it. "Is this enough?" I asked Sylvie. She permitted herself a small, careful smile. "It's a strong start." Sylvie filed a formal motion to vacate the settlement on grounds of fraudulent conveyance, attaching the emails as exhibits. She also filed for a temporary injunction preventing any sale or transfer of assets held within Millbrook Ridge Properties, LLC, while the motion was pending. The injunction was granted within 48 hours. Lawson did not contact me directly. What I received instead came through channels he apparently found safer. Sloane drove up from Concord on a Saturday morning. She sat at Audra's kitchen table with her hands folded on the surface and said that her father was concerned about the toll this process was taking on everyone and that she hoped I would consider what prolonged litigation would cost, not just financially, but in terms of the family. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. "Sloane," I said, keeping my voice even, The house was transferred into an LLC without my knowledge. There are emails proving your father designed this specifically to exclude me before he filed. I am not pursuing this out of spite. I'm pursuing it because it was fraud. Something shifted in her expression, a quick recalibration of what she had expected me to say. Dad says those emails are being misrepresented. Then his attorneys can explain that to the judge, I said. She stayed another hour, cycling back through the same points: the family, his age, the cost of continued litigation. When she left, she hugged me at the door with the same careful embrace she had given me after the original hearing, and I watched her car pull away down Audra's street and sat with the particular sadness that has no clean name, the feeling of being loved by someone who has chosen, in the moment that matters, to love someone else a little more. The revised settlement offer arrived in early spring. Lawson's attorneys proposed $720,000 in exchange for a comprehensive release of all claims against him personally, against Millbrook Ridge Properties, LLC, and against Sandrine Colby. The release also included a non-disparagement clause that would prevent me from discussing the circumstances of my divorce with anyone. I read every word of it in Sylvie's office. When I finished, I set the papers down. "He's worried," I said. "Significantly," Sylvie said. "I thought about $720,000 the way you think about any real thing when you are 70 years old, with no property and mounting legal fees. I thought about it genuinely. It would cover the rest of my life, comfortably, without the arithmetic that woke me at 3 a.m. But the non-disparagement clause, the release that covered Sandrine Colby, those provisions were not designed to give me a fair outcome. They were designed to seal what had happened behind a legal wall so that the record would say nothing, permanently, completely, forever. And it mattered to me that the record would say something, not just in my memory or Audra's kitchen or Sylvie's files, in a court document, official, established, real. I had spent 46 years as Lawson Ellison's wife, and for the last of those years I had been deceived and outmaneuvered, while he drank his strong coffee and pretended to love me. I wanted the record to state what had happened. I wanted that more than $720,000. "I'm declining," I said. Sylvie picked up her pen. 3 weeks before the September hearing, something happened that I had not anticipated. Prescott called me on a Sunday morning, not with a tight voice and a rehearsed script. His voice was unsteady in a way I had not heard from him since he was a young man. He told me he had been contacted by a financial examiner reviewing the LLC's formation documents and had discovered, for the first time, that his name had been listed as co-trustee of a related holding entity, one that Lawson had established without explaining what it was for. He had thought he was signing a routine estate document. He had not known the timing. He had not understood the implications. He said he was sorry. He said it more than once, and differently each time, the way you say something when you mean it, rather than when you are performing it. I listened to all of it. "Prescott," I said when he finished, "I believe you." I did believe him. He was not strategic enough to have understood what was being done with his name. That was the thing about Lawson. He had always used other people's trust as a resource. He had used mine for 46 years without my noticing. He had used our sons without Prescott's knowledge. And he had used Sandrine's willingness to be used, which is a different kind of transaction, and one she would eventually have to reckon with herself. The September hearing lasted 5 hours. Lawson arrived with his 3 attorneys. He was thinner than he had been in the spring, and he sat very still at his table and did not look at me except once, when he first entered, a quick assessment he tried to make look incidental. Judge Wainwright was in her mid-60s, methodical, with the patience of someone who has spent decades in a room where people say things they hope will not be examined too carefully. She asked Lawson's lead attorney a question. She asked why, if the LLC had been formed for estate planning purposes, the primary communications surrounding it had focused on ensuring the property was outside the marital estate prior to filing. The attorney answered. She asked a follow-up. The questions became more specific, narrowing toward a corner with no exit. And then, Lawson leaned forward and interrupted his own attorney mid-sentence. "That house was built with my money," he said, not quietly enough. "My name on every loan, my contracts, my labor." The courtroom went still. Judge Wainwright looked at Lawson directly. "Mr. Ellison, your attorney is addressing the court." Lawson straightened. His attorney put a hand on his arm. Lawson shook it off, the small, sharp dismissal of anyone who tried to contain him. I had seen that gesture for 46 years, turned outward at contractors and neighbors, and the occasional family member who had pushed too far. I had never been on the receiving end of it, which had allowed me to overlook what it meant about him. I understood it clearly now. The ruling came on a Wednesday morning, 19 days later. Sylvie called at 8:45. She had already read the opinion twice. Judge Wainwright had found by clear and convincing evidence that Lawson Ellison had engaged in fraudulent conveyance of marital property with intent to deprive Maeve Ellison of her equitable share of the marital estate. The January emails were cited extensively. The original settlement was vacated. The assets of Millbrook Ridge Properties, LLC, were ordered returned to the marital estate for proper equitable distribution. Based on Massachusetts equitable distribution standards, I was awarded 58% of the total, a figure that came, after accounting for all assets, to approximately $2.4 million. Sandrine Colby was named as a knowing participant and ordered to provide a full accounting of all professional fees she had collected from Lawson during the relevant period. A separate civil claim was possible if I chose to pursue it. I sat in Audra's kitchen with the phone against my ear and looked out the window at the backyard, where the rose of Sharon was still in bloom, unexpectedly late for the season. "Maeve," Sylvie said, "did you hear all of it?" "Yes," I said, "every word." Audra was in the doorway. She had heard enough from my face and my silence. We held each other in her kitchen the way sisters do. Not gracefully, just completely, and I felt for the first time in a long time the specific weight of something I had been carrying set down. We didn't speak for a long moment. There was nothing that needed saying that the silence couldn't hold better. I did not know then what would come next for Lawson. I learned it in pieces over the following months. Sandrine's billing practices had drawn scrutiny from a state licensing board during the discovery process, and several of her larger clients ended their contracts once the details of the case became known in professional circles. By the time Millbrook Road sold in the spring for $3.95 million, $150,000 above the initial ask, she had already moved out of the Providence apartment Lawson had helped pay for. I was told she had relocated. I did not verify that. It was not information I needed. Lawson called me once, 6 weeks after the ruling. I let it go to voicemail. He did not leave a message. I held the phone for a moment after his name disappeared from the screen, and then I set it face down on the table the way he used to, and I went back to what I was reading. I moved to Maine in November. Not to Audra's neighborhood exactly. A town 20 minutes north. A small house on a quiet street with a manageable yard and a back porch that faces east so the morning light comes in long and flat across the floorboards. I walked the shoreline most mornings. I found a library branch where I began volunteering on Thursdays, which is different from being a librarian but shares the essential thing. The belief that a room full of books is a room full of possibilities, and that people deserve access to both. I found a book group that met on the second Tuesday of each month. A woman named Tilda, 69, a retired nurse who argued about fiction with the cheerful aggression of someone who takes stories seriously, became my closest friend in the new town. We walked the Harbor Road twice a week and complained about the same novels and laughed at things I had forgotten. I still knew how to find funny. Prescott and I rebuilt slowly. He had cooperated voluntarily with the examination once he understood what his name had been used for error, confirming that he had not known the purpose of the documents he'd signed. He did not ask me to forgive him. He asked if we could find a way back to each other. I said yes, and I meant it, and we have been finding it in the careful way that trust is rebuilt when it has been genuinely damaged. Each phone call a small repair, each visit a little less tentative than the one before. Sloane took longer. She sent an email in December that was 3 paragraphs long and did not apologize for anything specific, which told me more than a specific apology might have, I replied. We are in the careful middle ground that is not warm but is not cold. Something workable and honest, which is sometimes the best available thing, and which I have come to believe is worth more than a peace that is only maintained by not looking too closely at things. I planted 2 Meyer lemon trees on the back porch. They bloom in late February, and the smell fills the whole east side of the house with something clean and extravagant that I was not expecting and cannot quite explain. I have learned not to question the things that surprise you into gratitude. Here is what I know now that I did not know at 70. Age is not the end of options. Grief is not the end of clarity. And the people who build their plans on your silence are almost always undone by your voice. I am not a remarkable woman. I am a woman who sat in her sister's kitchen on a February morning and asked the right question, and then drove to Cambridge in her good blazer, and then refused to accept a settlement that would have erased the truth in exchange for a number. Sometimes that is all it takes. If this story stayed with you, leave me a comment and subscribe, and thank you truly for listening.